All right, just as a little quiz, for lack of better words, you're not turning it in. But for what we've done so far, if you don't have your travistritt.com up, the folder up, bring the folder up, bring up your styles.css file, and attempt, please, to put in these 5 things. I'll give you 5 minutes or so to work on it. Okay, and then we'll go over all of them. Now, I didn't do these, so when you do it, if you tell me, oh, I did it, but it looks terrible. Okay, then it looks terrible. You can always remove it, but it just so we have some practice. You don't have to sit and listen to me talk all period. Give you a couple more minutes. Well, hopefully this did enough to at least make you think. How's that? And to start with, I just broke it down so I can show you each one. You didn't have, of course, you wouldn't comment the CSS file this much, but just so you know exactly what I'm doing in here. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to make all H1 tags orange. Now, just so you know, I've been accused of this, not by you, but by people over the years. It's like, man, you're really anal. As far as I used to always do this and then put my stuff in there and then put this on a separate line. I always did it like that. I don't as much anymore, just because what you see as far as the way this is set up, it's almost always done like this. If you're more comfortable putting stuff on their own lines, you can do that. It doesn't really hurt anything. All right, but what do we want in here? We want all these to be orange, so color, orange. And again, we could have gone out. Maybe you did this. You could find the hex code for orange. You could find the RGB for orange. You can put it in that way. I mean, personally, I think that if you know that, typically if you put in orange and you're like, that's close, then you're probably going to have to go to a hex code or an RGB. All right? Because when you put in those colors that they show, those predefined ones, they're going to be whatever it's basically been set up for the machine. So that's that first one. Okay, so that will automatically make everything orange. Let's see if it works. All right, there it is. Now, I only have the one page on here, so I can't show you all the pages, but ideally, at least, they would all be orange. All right. Next, make only the H1 tag on the home page pink. Well, if there's only one of them, it would seem to me to make sense to make that an ID. All right. Now, one thing about this, you may have done this, and what I'm about to tell you, it's not wrong if you did it. All right, but a lot of times people will do this. They'll write here, pink header. That's not considered a good name, because later it might change. Also, you might decide later you want to make it a class, and it's called header, and it's pink. And you may want to have it a class so you can use it on paragraphs or whatever. Programming people are notorious that once they put something in, they don't like to ever change it. You say, well, you could just change it with search and replace. Sometimes these things grow out of control, and it's very hard, a lot harder to do that than you think it would be. All right, and I don't know what a good name for this is. It says make the H1 tag on the home page pink. I might call this something like home page header. I don't know. All right. But I'm going to come in here, and again, I'm going to say color pink. All right, and I call that home page header. Well, you'll notice if I run this again, it sure as heck isn't going to be pink, because I haven't applied that to my index.html page yet. So let's do that. So I'm going to come back into here. Now I've got class equals that. And maybe that's even what I called it. I don't remember. Was it? Oops, that's not what I want. Home page header. So let's copy that. And then I'm going to go back to my home page. And that H1, now I want this to be an ID. Home page header. Let's see now if I run this, if the one on the home page is pink. And it is. All right. I mean, again, much of the stuff that we're doing right now, as the saying goes, it's not rocket science. When you go in and you start really doing stuff with CSS as far as adding animations and transitions, and even what you'll see towards the end of the chapter when we start talking about shadows, that's a little bit more complex. All right. And what we get to towards the end of this part of the class is we'll talk about something that's called Jquery. We'll work more with that in the second 9 weeks. But Jquery is a JavaScript library that you can use with CSS. It gives CSS almost unlimited power. And it's anything that you do with Jquery you could do without it, But you can sometimes write one line of code what will take you 10 to 15 lines to write and 15 lines of regular CSS. I'll take the one line, please. All right. Okay, so we've got those two. They appear to work. Number 3, add a class called Big Font to the first paragraph on the home page. It's a class, so dot Big Font. All right. And so font size 250%. All right. It's a class, so I'm going to have to, I use the dot, but I'm going to have to say class equals, and it's called Big Font. And I want it to the first paragraph on my home page. So that's right here. Class equals Big Font. I'm going to save it, run this. Well, something looks funky, so let's go back and double check. Class equal Big Font. Big Font. I didn't save. Okay, that might have something to do with it. Yeah, that now looks a little bit different. So you can see there's the one that's 2.5 times. And come on. There's the one that's regular size. All right. That was an example of working with percentages. That says make it 2.5 times what's the default size. All right. Get rid of some of these. They're slowing it down a little bit. So, all right. Number 4, then apply the big font to the H1 that's on the home page. Well, there's no CSS to do that. We just have to go back into here, and there's our H1. It doesn't matter if you say ID equals, then class equals, or class equals, then ID equals. It doesn't matter. But these things, what you'll find, if you haven't already, they're pretty much are case sensitive. So if I would have said big font all in lowercase, it might work, it might not work. All right? That's why a lot of people just will take everything and make it lowercase. Okay. So I've got that. I've saved. That's saved. All right, let's take a look if this works. Oops. If this works, that's a lot bigger than it was before. You'll see it's pretty much looks now like it's the same size. All right. And then finally, there was one more, I think. No, a couple more. I just did that. So number 5. Add an ID to the footer on the home page. All right. So it's an ID. Even though it's for a footer tag, I can still call it footer. That's totally fine. And what I want here, and I gave you the code, is I want to say text align right. And as you'd probably guess, that means right align it. All right. Again, this is the way I set up the page, the indentation I use, etc. You don't like that, come up with your own way, but come up with a way that makes sense to you. All right, like I said, something as simple as, if that's easier for you to read with the curly brace on its own line, do it that way. All right, that's what I want, is I want you to start establishing your own style. You may go to work for a company where they have their own standard, and you do it that way if you want to stay employed there. And you might go to work for a company, they might hire you in as a web developer, they might not even have a web page. So you make up all the rules. All right? All right, so we've got for our footer, I want to come down to my footer, and I'm going to say here, ID equals footer. It wasn't ID, I believe, wasn't it? Yes. All right. Again, one of the reasons I had you do this, I'm not trying to waste my time or your time, but you make some changes and you can immediately see whether or not they worked. All right. As you can probably guess, if you looked at that and said, I'm sorry, Jeff, that's just ugly. Okay, then you could come down here and instead of saying right, you could center align it. All right, and you can go in and immediately look at your change. All right. Any questions on any of those? Any of those that did not make sense to you? Again, as we move on in here, we're going to be adding more stuff. And as you'd guess, it would be more complex. All right? Sure. You know, I've always said this, and honestly, I mean it too, okay? Just so you know, I mean this. There aren't stupid questions. And if you have a question, somebody else probably has the same question. That said, I do remember I was in class one day giving a lecture like this, and it was about the second week. And a guy raised his hand, and I said, yeah. And he was being very serious. If he was kidding, he didn't act like it. He goes, is this stuff going to get harder than this? And I thought, wow, that's really an interesting question to ask in like the second week of class. And my first inclination was to be a real wise aleck and go, no, we do the hard stuff first, and then it gets extremely easy. But I answered it by saying, well, what do you think? So, well, it'll probably get a lot harder. And I said, that's a pretty good assumption to make. All right. If you have done this, if you have looked at the Travis Tritt homepage by going to the irregular one and doing a right mouse click and choosing View Page Source, you'll notice it's hundreds of lines long. And there's a lot of stuff in here. You'll see some of the tags, and you go, oh, now I know what that means. I know what that means. And there'll be a ton of stuff in there that you won't have a clue as what it means. There's a lot of stuff in there I don't know what it means. You got it?
Yeah, you sort of a little bit.
Again, if you want to do it like right align it, then you'd put right in there, of course, instead of center. All right?
Yeah, I didn't have the
Gotcha. Okay, everybody's up to speed, you all caught up, etc., right?
You gave the other page for the one?
Yeah, everybody's good? Connor back there, everything's fine? Good. All right. So let's go back and go back to here and go back to here. All right. Now, Gabriel before asked a really good question about what if you have both an ID and a class. And that's how the cascading part works in here. And that's how I guess it got its name. When you look here, and I'm on page 143, this says the order in which things are applied. Now there's a tag in here, a thing I have not even mentioned to you. It's if you start a tag and you put in there exclamation point important, it's supposed to override everything. All right. The bad thing is what a lot of companies started doing was when they did that is if they had multiple developers, well, mine's more important, so they made everything exclamation point important, which doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. You should really try to minimize that as much as possible for something that indeed is important. All right? So, important declarations on an individual sheet, on a web page, etc. The normal declarations. The bottom line is this. Believe it or not, there is some CSS that's automatically provided on a page by the browser. We got rid of most of it, by putting in the normalized file. We would have gotten rid of even more if we would have used Eric Meyer's reset.css, where you saw there was still a little margin, still a little padding, etc. You wouldn't have had any of that. All right? But the point is that if you want control, okay, so if I sit there, if this is my CSS file like this, and, well, in fact, let's look at this one. What we just did, and again, it goes back to the question that was asked. If you have on here both an ID and a class, if for some reason those two are fighting with one another, all right, so what was homepage header? Well, homepage header said, in fact, it's an H1. It said it should automatically be orange, correct? That was built in from what we put in. But we said overwrite that. Okay, in this big font, if we had said, I'm going to try this because it shouldn't work, color, I don't know, yellow. All right, so I'm going to do that. You don't have to do it, but I'm going to run this. Did that turn yellow? No. Did this turn yellow? Yes. Because the paragraph only has the big font class associated with it. The H1 tag has both the big font class, which would have made it yellow, but it also has the ID of whatever we call that, which was pink. All right, and IDs trump classes. All right. And sometimes, to be honest with you, the only way to learn this is to just sit there and do it. Create a page and start putting all sorts of stuff out there. And again, as I mentioned, and I'm not trying to push this stuff down your throats. You're going to learn this the way you're going to learn this. But if you go in here, notice colors, backgrounds, etc. But there's a thing in here, I don't know where it is, but there's something in here that's going to talk about IDs, and it's going to talk about classes. And they're going to give you a boatload of examples in here. How to use the developer tools to inspect the styles that have been applied. Let's do that. I'm not going to use this. I'm going to use the page that we have. So I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to bring up this page. There you go. And I'm going to hit my F12. You got the function keys at the top of the page of your keyboard. Usually you should have an F1 through F12. I'm going to hit F12. It's a toggle. So hitting F12 turns it on. Hitting F12 again turns it off. All right, so it's now I turn it back on. I'm going to go to my elements, and this has to do with the size of my screen more than anything else, but you can see this. So notice I can highlight whatever I want, all right, and I can come in here and it'll show me the settings for those things. All right, and I can come in here and open stuff up or close stuff up depending on what I want to do. So there's my footer, etc. I can see that for the footer, notice, hey Jeff, you never said display block. You never said margin 8x. The system will put in automatically some stuff for you. All right? So you can start to learn about this stuff in that way, and you can look at the elements. At the elements, rather. All right? And that's what they talk about in there. And if you say that's just kind of confusing, then don't do it now. Go back when you feel a little bit more comfortable and start looking at it then. They show you a better example here in the book on page 145. All right. There's other things that you can do with developer tools too. We will get into some of them as we go on in here. All right, next is how to work with text. Some of this we've already covered. Okay. Notice it says the 5 generic font families. In other words, virtually every machine has got these 5 fonts. All right? And there's examples of each one of them. And some books will tell you you use a serif for printing or showing it on a page, and a sans serif for printing it out, if you're going to print out something. Some will actually tell you the opposite. All right. Sometimes you'll have some say-so over what fonts used. Sometimes you won't. I already showed you this. There's an example of a font family. The key takeaway, look on the screen, please, is if you're using a font and that font has in it a blank space, you must put it within double quotes. Single quotes probably would work too. It's just kind of historically people put it in double quotes. But this would break if we said Courier New and you didn't have the quotes around it. System does not know. It says, okay, you've got Courier, that's a font type, and then it says the word new, that's like a new command, and it doesn't even know what new means. All right? You can set up font families. I already showed you the font size. Okay, and if the font size, I think the font size of an H1 tag is probably around 24 points, something like that. So had we said, instead of 2.5 times, okay, we could have said, for example, like 4.5 M's. You see what I'm saying? So there's always multiple ways of doing the same thing. Right? All right, how to set other properties for styling fonts. Yeah, there's a lot of other stuff. Okay, some of this is a little bit confusing, such as, well, notice font style. The normal, it says how the font is slanted. Normal, which means if you don't add anything, it's normal. So if you say font style normal, that's redundant to say that. I've never seen that inside of any CSS file. If you want something to be bolded, you're going to use font weight in a minute. If you want it to be italicized, you're going to say font style italic. Oblique and italic are basically the same thing. But oblique's been around forever, so they don't get rid of it. All right, font margin. This is This is a little bit confusing. All right, notice you can use bold, bolder, you can use lighter, and you can use colors from 100 to 900. And it's recommended you only use the whole 100 numbers. Like, don't put 468, for example. I don't even know if that would work. I have no idea. I've never tried it. Typically, if you want something bolded, you'll just say font weight bold, period. Now, what does that do? To say font weight bold, if I want to take a paragraph and bold it, now I don't have to put bold tags around it or strong tags. All right? Why is that a good thing? Because, again, I'm segregating the CSS from the HTML. That's what we want to do. All right. Line height. How big your line literally is on the page. You can play with that. That becomes important. In fact, if you look at Travis's real site here, I'm not sure exactly how they did that. I didn't look at the CSS, but it looks like the font is the same size as the star is, but if the star had been bigger than the font, and you wanted to make sure that the word news aligned with this, you would have to do some centering. The funny thing is, the centering you do is not on the word news. You do the centering on the image, which would be on the star. Right? So you can combine these in any way you want. Sometimes you see this, people will put all this stuff in there. Sometimes they'll break it up into a bunch of different lines. Whatever makes the most sense to you is what you should be doing. Notice if you use a bunch of these, they're separated by spaces. All right, typically. Italic, bold, etc. Then this has got the comma there because that's a font family. All right. Again, if you find that confusing, just do them one at a time. More formatting stuff here. Indentation. You know, it's not that big a thing anymore. I'll tell you the truth. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be imposing political types of views on you, but it scares me when I hear that, for example, they're not even teaching kids cursive writing anymore because nobody writes their name. Nobody ever has to sign anything, and if they do, it's on it's on some kind of a pad or whatever. All right. But I remember not only did we have to learn cursive, we had to indent. All right. Sometimes you do want indentation for paragraphs. Sometimes you want a blank line between paragraphs. It depends on how you're writing, and it depends, exactly the effect that you're looking for. The vertical alignment, as it says, that's the alignment of text, and that you can use some of that in what I just showed you with that star and then the word that comes next to it. All right, and again, they give you some examples in here. So they show you the code they're adding, and they show you what it looks like afterward. All right. Now we're pretty close to the end of the chapter, so let's take a look. This is shadows, because this is a little bit confusing. Now you may look up here, if you would, on the screen. Some people like this. Some people find that, oh, that's like this. what they did was they created a shadow that's the same color. It's the same color as the text itself. This is a case where when you create the shadow, what you might want to do is you might want to use some of that opacity that we talked about before to lighten it up a bit, or even make a gray shadow or a black shadow or a white shadow or whatever. All right? And again, typically when you do this, it's for effect. So, text shadow, horizontal offset, vertical offset, blur radius, shadow colors. Like clear as mud. So let's look at what we have right here. Horizontal offset. So basically it's saying put it 4 pixels away. If you didn't put any offset, it would write it right over itself. That's not a shadow. All right? So that's basically how far you want it away horizontally. All right? And then how much you want it away vertically. Those are oftentimes going to be the same number. And how do you learn this? I would just copy something like what they have right here and really start playing with the numbers. All right, and play with the colors just to see what happens. Now, a couple things. Accessibility. It says, remember the video or the visually impaired. Too much shadow or blur makes it hard. My eyes aren't that great anymore, and some of that stuff, that's not bad. The other one's not bad either. But sometimes you see this stuff overused. That's a big thing with a lot of the stuff we've been looking at. You know, if I go and write something and I think, well, this is really important, and it's going to go on the web, and they say, well, why don't you take the most important part and we'll bold it. Now, well, it's all important. They're not going to probably bold the whole thing. But that actually takes away from the effect rather than adding to the effect. And blur and some of this other stuff we're going to get into. In later chapters, we'll do things like, for instance, this, I don't know if this, with this heading, if they actually put a border around it, but we'll learn how to put rounded edges on those borders. Rounded edges on your buttons, etc. when you start to create buttons. Now, this is really important, okay? And it talks about floating. Okay, and floating is an important concept, not as important as it used to be, but it still is important. If you tell something to float to the left, you're telling it to move as far left as it can. If you tell something to float to the right, it moves as far right as it possibly can. Okay? Now, if you look on here, what they've done with this image is they've floated it to the left. If they put float right, it would appear over here. Does that make sense to you? All right. I don't believe there's a float center. You know, again, no one's ever asked. I just came into my head right now. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. All right. One thing to realize is when you start to float stuff, everything that comes after that keeps floating until you turn the floating off. All right. So a lot of times, and you're going to see this in just a couple minutes, and again, not only do you turn it on, but you turn it off. The advantage here, and I showed you this before, this was how it used to look. So you put an image tag in there, and then you put in, let's say this is an H2. Remember, an H2 is a block level, so that's what put that blank line in there. All right? But when you floated it, you basically said to override that. So that became this. And you, as you can see now, they put some shadowing and stuff in here as well. This is how you clear it. And in fact, you can do a clear left, you can do a clear right, but quite often what you see is people will literally write themselves, instead of saying main like that, they'll make a class and they'll call it clear fix. And they'll just say there, clear, colon, both. That means if you've got any floating, left or right, doesn't matter, clear it out. So set it back to the way it would be normally. All right? Now, I'm not going to read to you, but again, you can read this. Notice it says here in chapters 5 and 6, which we'll get into next week sometime, all right, we're going to look at this in more depth and breadth of coverage. Now, I do want to just say one more thing about this, and I want you to hear this, because it's something we're going to cover, but not for quite a while yet. All right, I'm just going to come way down here, hit enter a few times. All right. The reason that I said that floats are important, but not as important as they used to be, is really two different topics that we're going to cover in later classes. You saw these the first day, but one is called Flex, but it's really Flex Box, and the other is called CSS Grid. When you use Flexbox, you've got a lot more control over where anything on any line of your page goes. You don't have to play with floats. All right. There are all sorts of articles online, why I hate floats, that you can read because people just don't like them. But Flexbox, you don't really have to do any of that anymore. You've got so much more control. Grid gives you some too. So again, on this one right here, the one that's on the end, that's what they're showing you here. So what do they show you? They show you what it'll look like. Then they show you the associated HTML. Notice they've added normalize, then main. They call theirs main.css. It's no big thing. They've got a couple classes in here for the October and the November. What do those classes do? It's class equal date past. Well, that's in the CSS. So, in date past, it's in here someplace. See it? But it's in here. The point is, you get the idea. Now, just so you know, it's historically the way that people do this is they take the stuff that's going to affect the whole document, body, etc. You put that on the top. I like to set my CSS up so it follows my page. Okay? So if I'm going to do something with all my H1s tags, let's say, and I got an H1 near the top, that's going to be right after the body then, type of thing. Unfortunately, what you find is people just throw stuff in anywhere. That's not really a good idea. And you know how to make comments. All right, so sometimes I'll even put a comment in for my body section, etc., and break it down like that. Everyone's different in the way they do this stuff. All right. All right. So it says, at this point, you should know how to code all types of selectors. No, you have been introduced to coding these. All right. I'm not that whatever enough, brazen enough, or whatever to say, yeah, you get all this stuff now. If you want to take your knowledge further than where we have been thus far, because we're going to go farther, go out to this and start looking at it. Hopefully it'll make some more sense right now. All right, if you do that. Okay, what I'm going to do, see how long have we been going here? Not too long. Is what I'd like to do is I'm going to give you out the Chapter 4 test right now, and it's about 9:55. I'll give you till about 10 after to work on it. All right, and then we will go over it. Okay.